Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into something that I think a lot of people are curious about, but maybe don't fully understand.
Yeah,
And that's the whole world of evictions in California.
definitely.
So we've got a stack of legal guides here, all written for California landlords, and we're going to go through them and pull out the need-to-know info.
Sounds like a plan.
So whether you're a landlord yourself, or maybe you rent, or even if you're just someone who wants to understand how this part of the law works,
Right.
this deep dive is for you. We're going to be talking about the specific procedures that need to be followed, the surprising differences between at-fault and no-fault evictions.
Oh, yeah. There are a lot of misconceptions out there.
There are. And that's why we've got expert speaker here with us.
Happy to help break it all down.
Yeah. They're going to unpack all the legal jargon for us and really highlight what you need to know.
Definitely. It can be complicated.
It can be. So let's start with the big change in the game here.
Okay.
California's Tenant Protection Act of 2019.
Right.
This law brought in a lot of stricter rules around evictions, all aiming to protect tenants' rights. And one of the biggest things is this emphasis on documentation.
Huge. That's right.
So every step of the way needs to be really carefully recorded.
It does. From the initial notices that are given to any court filings, everything needs to be well documented. And this is to protect both landlords and tenants by making sure the whole process is really clear and transparent.
So that's interesting. So it's not just protecting tenants.
No, it protects everyone involved.
It's protecting everyone involved.
Exactly.
That makes sense. So nobody ends up in like a he said, she said situation.
Exactly.
One thing that really stood out to me in these guides is how specific California law is about eviction notices.
Oh, yeah. Very specific.
Like even a small mistake with the timing or how you deliver the notice
It's true.
could totally invalidate the whole thing.
You could have a completely legitimate reason to evict someone.
Right.
But if you don't follow those exact notice requirements that are in the law, you might have to start the whole process over.
So that's a really important thing for landlords to be aware of.
It definitely is.
Now let's talk about the reasons behind evictions. The guides are really clear about this distinction between at-fault and no-fault situations.
Right.
Can you just quickly explain what the difference is there?
Sure. So at-fault evictions are when the tenant has done something to violate the agreement.
Okay.
Like they haven't paid rent, or they've violated the lease terms, or they've damaged the property in some way.
Right. And no-fault evictions are kind of a different animal.
Exactly. A no-fault eviction means the landlord has a reason to want the tenant to leave,
Okay.
even though the tenant hasn't actually done anything wrong.
Okay.
So, for example, maybe they're selling the property, or they want to move in themselves, or they're planning a major renovation.
So even if a tenant is doing everything right,
Right.
they could still be asked to leave under certain circumstances.
That's right.
That's probably surprising to some people.
It can be.
But I bet even in those no-fault situations, landlords still have to follow specific procedures.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Tenants still have rights, even in a no-fault situation.
Right.
And those procedures have to be followed very carefully.
So let's actually dig into some of those common at-fault reasons,
Okay.
the ones that people are probably most likely to encounter. What are some of the examples from the guides?
Sure. So the guides mention unauthorized pets as one potential reason.
Okay.
So even something that seems pretty simple can actually become grounds for eviction if it goes against the lease agreement.
Right.
And then there's subletting without permission.
Yeah.
That's a big one. And of course, any criminal activity on the property,
Uh-huh.
all of those could lead to an eviction.
It really emphasizes how important that lease agreement is
Oh, absolutely.
for landlords to be really clear about what they expect
Yes.
and for tenants to understand their responsibilities.
Totally. Having a clear and comprehensive lease agreement is really the foundation of a good landlord-tenant relationship.
Yeah. And on the flip side, when we talk about no-fault evictions, things can get a little bit tricky there.
They can.
Imagine being a tenant who's doing everything right,
Yeah.
paying your rent on time, keeping the place clean,
Right.
and then you get an eviction notice because, the landlord's relative needs to move in.
Yeah. It can be tough. It can be really frustrating for tenants.
I bet.
But that's why those legal protections are so important.
Right.
Even if the landlord has a reason, it still has to be a fair process. They have to give you the right notice, and all those legal steps have to be followed really carefully.
So let's break it down then with a specific scenario.
Okay.
Let's say a tenant just hasn't paid their rent.
Okay.
What does that eviction timeline actually look like?
All right, so first, the landlord has to issue a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit.
Okay.
And this notice, it very clearly states how much is owed. And it gives the tenant 3 days to either pay up or move out.
What happens if the tenant does neither of those things?
If they don't pay or leave within those 3 days, then the landlord can file what's called an unlawful detainer action with the court.
Okay.
And that starts the formal eviction process.
So it goes to court, and then are there certain procedures there as well?
There are, yeah. And this is where it can get a little more complicated. But the important thing to remember is that the landlord can't just change the locks or force the tenant out. Only law enforcement acting on a court order can legally remove someone from the property.
So even in a case that seems as simple as not paying rent, there's a really specific legal process that has to be followed.
That's right.
And I bet there's a lot of waiting involved for the landlord.
There is, which is why that clear communication and the proper documentation is really important right from the very beginning.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense. But I do have a question. What happens if there are multiple people living in the unit?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Does that make the eviction process more complicated?
It can, yeah. The legal status of each occupant needs to be considered.
So, like, are they all on the lease?
Exactly. Are there any subletters? Are there unauthorized occupants? All those factors can make it more complex.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation?
Not at all. It really has to be assessed on a case-by-case basis.
And then there's the whole issue of abandoned property.
Right.
Like, what are the landlord's responsibilities there?
Right.
Can they just, like, throw everything out?
That's a great question, and no, they can't. California law actually has really specific procedures for dealing with abandoned property.
So there are rules about that, too?
Oh, yeah. The landlord can't just get rid of it. They have to store it for a certain amount of time. And they have to make reasonable attempts to contact the former tenant.
It sounds like every step of the way there are safeguards in place.
There are.
To protect both landlords and tenants.
That's the goal, right. To create a process that is fair and just, even in a situation that can be as stressful as an eviction.
Okay. This has been really insightful so far, but we've been talking a lot about the landlord's perspective.
Right.
Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about tenant rights.
Okay, sure.
It's easy to kind of get caught up in the landlord's side of things, but it's really important to remember that tenants have legal protections too.
Absolutely.
And California law is very clear about that.
Yeah.
It really emphasizes this idea of due process. So tenants have the right to a fair hearing and the opportunity to defend themselves. So they can't just be kicked out without a chance to say their side of the story.
Exactly.
Even if they missed a rent payment.
Right.
Or they violated a lease term.
Yeah. They might have a legitimate reason for that missed payment. Or maybe there's a misunderstanding about what the lease actually says.
Right.
The legal process makes sure that they have that chance to explain themselves.
Right.
And hopefully avoid being evicted.
So there's some balance there.
Exactly.
It's reassuring to know that there are these systems in place to make sure things are fair for both sides.
Yeah.
And I imagine that having a lawyer in those situations can be pretty helpful for tenants.
Oh, absolutely. Having an attorney can make a huge difference.
Right.
Because they can help tenants understand their rights, navigate the whole legal system, and potentially even negotiate with the landlord.
Okay.
To find some kind of resolution.
Speaking of finding solutions, the guides mention something called alternative dispute resolution.
Oh, yeah.
What is that?
That's a great point. And a lot of people don't realize that there are ways to resolve things
Okay.
without going through that whole court process, that formal eviction process. Mediation is a really common example.
Okay.
That's where you have a neutral third party and they come in and they basically help the landlord and the tenant talk to each other.
Oh, okay.
Understand each other's perspective.
So it's a way to kind of resolve things without the time and the cost and the stress of going to court.
Exactly. It's usually a lot faster and less adversarial.
Right.
And oftentimes just having that structured conversation with a mediator
Okay.
can clear up misunderstandings and lead to a compromise that works for both sides.
That's a good option to have.
It is.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
Let's try to pull out some of the key takeaways.
Okay.
The main points for our listeners.
Sure. First and foremost, I think the big takeaway is that eviction in California is a very, very regulated process.
Right.
There are a lot of very specific rules and procedures that have to be followed by both landlords and tenants.
And we're talking about this, but documentation is key every step of the way.
Every step of the way. From the moment you serve those notices to filing those documents in court.
Right.
Having that paper trail is super important.
To protect everyone involved.
Exactly. And remember, we talked about the fact that even though it can get really complex, there are ways to try to resolve these disputes without having to go through that whole formal eviction process.
Right, like that mediation we were just talking about.
Yes.
So knowing your rights, knowing your options is really important, whether you're a landlord or a tenant.
Absolutely. And if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to reach out for some legal advice, because it's always better to be safe than sorry.
Great advice. And for listeners who want to explore this topic further, and I think it's pretty clear that there's a lot to explore here.
There is.
What are some resources that you recommend? Where should they go to learn more?
Well, the California Courts website is a great place to start.
Okay.
They have a ton of information on landlord-tenant law, including really detailed explanations of the entire eviction process.
Okay.
And there are also a bunch of legal aid organizations all over the state that offer free or low-cost help to tenants who are dealing with potential evictions.
Okay, we'll be sure to link to all those resources in the show notes.
Perfect.
So people can easily find them. Okay. This has been a really, really fascinating deep dive.
It has been.
Into the whole world of eviction in California.
Yeah.
And I think we've shed some light on a process that can be kind of confusing.
It can be.
But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier.
Okay.
This idea of the balance of power between landlords and tenants. Given all these specific procedures and all this emphasis on documentation, what does that tell us about how that relationship is viewed in California?
That's a really interesting question. I think on the one hand, you've got these really strong tenant protections in place. They really emphasize due process, fairness.
Right.
But at the same time, navigating all the complexities of the legal system can be really challenging.
Yeah.
Especially for tenants who maybe don't have a lot of resources.
Right.
Or they can't afford to hire a lawyer.
So it kind of makes you wonder.
It does.
Does the system actually level the playing field?
Right.
Or does it actually end up favoring people who have more knowledge and more resources?
That's the big question.
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Something to think about.
It is.
Well, expert speaker, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
This has been a super interesting deep dive.
It has.
Into a really important topic.
Yeah.
And I think our listeners are walking away with a much clearer understanding.
Hopefully.
Of how evictions actually work in California.
That's the goal.
So listeners, we hope you found this exploration valuable. Whether you're a landlord trying to figure out this whole eviction process or a tenant who wants to know what your rights are.
Yeah.
We encourage you to stay informed, to seek help if you need it.
Absolutely.
And to remember that clear communication and understanding the law can really go a long way in making sure things are fair.
For everyone involved.
That's right.
Yeah, it really underscores how important those legal aid organizations are that you mentioned.
Yeah.
You know, they can be such a valuable resource.
Absolutely.
For people who maybe wouldn't otherwise have that knowledge.
Yeah, for sure.
Or that access to help.
Yeah, knowledge is power. And especially when it comes to something like eviction law.
Right.
Having the right information and guidance can really make all the difference.
Well said. Well said. So I think we've done a pretty good job exploring the ins and outs of evictions in California.
Yeah, we covered a lot.
We did. From the specific procedures and the timelines to the rights and responsibilities for landlords and tenants.
Definitely.
So listeners, we hope you found this deep dive helpful.
I hope so.
Whether you're a landlord and you're trying to navigate this whole process, or you're a tenant and you want to make sure you understand your rights. We encourage you to stay informed.
Absolutely.
Seek guidance if you need it.
And remember that clear communication and a good understanding of the law can really go a long way.
For sure.
In making sure things are fair for everyone.
Exactly.
Well, expert speaker, thanks again for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Always great to have you on the show.
It's always fun.
And listeners, we'll catch you on our next deep dive.
See you then.
Call now 714-444-2999. 741. Thank you.